start the second part of this afternoon. And the first exposition we have now is Andreas Nemeth, Eva Salhoff, and Susanne Hanna-Guido from the Institute of Education at the University of Budapest, characteristics of the disciplinary shift in communication networks of the Hungarian educational science in the 1950s and 1960s. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for accepting the lecture for this conference. This presentation is part of a greater research that is concentrated on the development of the Hungarian educational science in the 20th century. This bigger project is financed by the Hungarian Scientific Research Fund. Senior lecturer is Professor Nádor, and my colleague in the project is Dr. Nádor. I am Eva Salhoff, and I am mostly engaged in the qualitative research aspect of this research. So from this bigger project, this presentation will concentrate on the 1950s and 60s in Hungary. We have double research aims to reveal the links between educational science and the ruling communist ideology in Hungary in the 1950s and 60s, and to show how the communication networks of educational science have changed during these years after the communist takeover. We have a twofold theoretical background to this research. First is Bourdieu's theory on the relationship between scientific and political fields, how they relate, especially in very sensitive political periods like the one in Hungary after the Second World War. And the other theoretical assumption is Becker's and Stichwey's theory on the scientific discipline model. This model states that discipline is a complex product of a given scientific community, and this scientific community has four very important elements which define the whole science: the members of the scientific community and the communication networks they develop, meaning journals, periodicals, textbooks, conferences, discourse on conferences, and so on. Another important element is the set of scientific knowledge based on research paradigms, accepted research paradigms and topics with an adequate research methodology, and finally the selection and preparation of a new scientific generation, how to educate them, how to prepare them in academic qualifications, how to establish higher education structure in order to educate this new scientific generation. So these are the theoretical starting points of the research we are doing. Just a few words about the historical background in Hungary. So we are after the Second World War, and not exactly after the war, but within a couple of years we can witness the emergence of the one-party system. And it's called in historical literature the Sovietization of the country, a communist takeover. And it went hand in hand with a command economy and a political ideological indoctrination that meant indoctrination in culture, science, education and even in everyday life in the country. Of course, this period from the 1948 up to the political changes in 1990 is not a homogeneous one. This period that we are researching now, the 50s and 60s, differ radically from the coming years of the 1970s and 80s and 90s. The research had a quantitative and a qualitative aspect. In the focus of the quantitative analysis were the analysis of contemporary journals. And since the research focused on the whole 20th century, two prominent educational journals were analyzed throughout the century. It was interesting to do this in order to show tendencies in many aspects, but now I'm going to talk about only some results concerning the 1950s and 60s. So, what did we do actually? A corpus of publications was set up. It meant the databases concerning journal articles and bibliographies. Up till now, we have 16,000 pieces of text from these journals to analyze. And then came the task of digitalizing this corpus in order to be able to work with it. Then a program was built for computer analyzing the texts. And then we set up categories of educational topics to handle this vast amount of data. Here, just to have a look at what characteristics of text were taken into consideration and what characteristics of authors were taken into consideration. Of course, authors are as important as texts and articles in journals because they were prominent scientists, educators of a period. Here you can see the further categorization of the educational text in 4 categories. Just to be able to read it: general education, institutions, theory of education, and teaching and learning. Of course, categorization like this can be always questioned, but we started to work with this type of categorization, and now I am going to show you one maybe interesting result of it. And this concerns educational discourse during the 20th century. So the chart shows what topics were found from the beginning of the 20th century up to the 1990s. And now we are interested in the 1950s and 60s. We are talking about the 1950s and 60s. Here you can see a growth of topics concerning general education. These blue arrows show this. And the point is how to explain this growth in another genre of educational writings. And one assumption is that after the communist takeover, it was very important to establish a new terminology, a new value system of education, and it also it concerned general educational issues. Or it was very important to interpret history of education in a different way from a communist aspect. Who were the heroes and who were not the heroes of the educational past. Newly emerging heroes came into the discourse, and general education topics and the growth in articles in these topics show this transitional period that is different from the, let's say, pre-war educational discourses. Of course, this is only one piece of result, and this vast amount of data can give further job for us to analyze and interpret them. Another finding concerns the age of authors who published in educational journals. It seems to be not an important question, but maybe it might be important when talking about the 1950s and 60s. Again, let's turn to the period of 1950s and 60s here. And here you can see that suddenly a relatively young body of authors enter into the field of education. How can we interpret this? What is behind this tendency? One explanation may be that new people, new young people, even without an academic background, enter into education. They are politically committed. They are ready to serve the political purposes of the party. They see the merging of education and politics as a possibility in their career. So, and also we can see that this generation, this young generation, stays in the discourse for relatively long time, 2 or 3 decades, meaning that they adjusted themselves to the system. They were academically accepted later on. And another interesting question is what happened to those who belong to an elder generation, and what happened then after this political shift. And this question leads us to the qualitative analysis of the educational discourses. These qualitative analyses are based on document analysis, content and discourse analysis, and case studies on institutional issues, academic institutional issues, biographies of prominent persons in the educational science. Again, in this line of research, we are at the beginning of our investigation. Just a couple of problems to show the direction of how we try to think about these problems. The main question is there a disciplinary shift in educational discourses after the communist takeover? And it seems to be a rhetoric kind of question. There is a radical rearrangement of the disciplinary field. What signs can we show about this rearrangement? And very important important thing is that the political and professional interactions and discourses overlap. It would be very difficult to tell whether if this is a political or an educational piece of text. Those who talk about educational issues talk about political issues as well. Another sign of this disciplinary rearrangement is that the autonomy of the discipline ceases to exist. If we accept that science is a quest for truth, then we can say that this is replaced by ideological commitment. Even it is a direct statement on the part of the Communist Party. Science as an objective, neutral something. It's not for communist people. It's for bourgeois capitalist people. So the ideological commitment is a key factor of the science. It's an immanent factor of science in this communist approach. Another very interesting element of this rearrangement is the discontinuity on different aspects. For instance, discontinuity of subject research, empirical pedagogy, child study movement is not accepted anymore. It means that it is heavily criticized in journals. It means that those professors who represent this kind of educational thinking are dismissed or retired from university chairs and are replaced by Marxist committed professors. We can talk about discontinuity in the structure of the higher education system and in academic qualification as well. It means that a Soviet-type system is introduced in higher education, how institutions and departments are established, what names what terminology is used to give names to certain departments. It's the same as in the Soviet Union, and the academic qualification system is also a Soviet-type sort of newly introduced issue during the 1950s. So these were just the first results and first problems faced in our research, and we are continuing both in the quantitative and in the qualitative strand to analyze the data and to analyze text. We even made some oral history interviews with people, scientists who witnessed this transitional period as those involved in it, and these personal memories also give us work to think on the subject in the center of our research. Thank you for your attention.
So we have more time for questions.
Yes, I have three questions of precision. I mean, just more demand for more detail, if possible. The first question is that you observe that political and educational issues are inseparable in this corpus that you've studied. I wonder whether this is linked to the multipositionality of the actors that you studied. And I wonder if you have looked into that. Second question is, you observed that the autonomy of the discipline of educational discipline ceased to exist under the period of the study. I wonder what are the indicators that you use to come to this observation, and how do you measure, for example, party commitment? How do you measure it? Third question is, you observed also the change, in terms of changes concerning subject matter. You said that child-centered, child study approaches, disappearance of child study approaches. I wonder whether these are the active pedagogy approaches. You see, what do you mean by child study approaches?
Yeah.
Is this the what's it called? The whole active pedagogy movement, new education
progressive
movement?
education.
Is that what is in question here? Is this what disappears?
I wanted to ask a little, I think it's a very, very interesting and very instructive project, but I wanted to a little bit ask about the homogeneous image of Sovietization that you seem to depict. I mean, first of all, can we really talk about the kind of value-free research tradition before 1945? I mean, Kornis-Gyula doesn't seem to me completely, value-free scholar. And then the other question would be that isn't there a bit more complication in terms of exactly like these kind of reform pedagogical traditions coming through in a very weird way from the Soviet tradition? I mean, not only Makarenko and not only the slap of Makarenko, but like a lot of other levels of this kind of communitarian Soviet experimental education coming in, also like Korchak, Levin. I mean, like, there is a lot of other intellectual traditions that are somehow coming together, funnily enough, with this Stalinist package. And of course, I'm thinking about Mirei and people like that who will then grow out of this and develop a completely alternative psychological, pedagogical project. So I mean, wouldn't we get a bit more, let's say, subtlety if we factor into this ambiguity of the whole Stalinist cultural package? And for many of the people who were actually coming from the reform pedagogical tradition, some elements of this Stalinist package could be used as a certain kind of even funnily enough, anti-authoritarian education.
Any other question?
It's really a small
Just a
question.
minute, Victor. Are you ready? Yes.
No more questions?
Yes.
Just one, if I remember well, this was a period of radical transformation of both on the side of the staff of pedagogy and the institutions. Now, in terms of institutions, there was a start of new development, that is, new institutions were put up. So I think pedagogy was one of the very few, maybe the only social science where new institutions were developed under the early communist regime. Could you say something about it?
Too many questions.
I'm sorry, but I have to ask one. The last question. First of all, I noticed in the thematical organization from the 40s until the 2006, the persistence in this was right there, like Aletanos pedagogy. I don't know what that is, but it was one thematical. It says something like Aletanos pedagogy. You feature that, but I see persistence. I don't see so many shifts. So I would like you to go back to that shift that you talked about. I mean, from the 40s, 50s to the 2006, and a more technical question. You identify the field of education with this corpus, with all these journals. So my question is, which journals are those, and why is that the field? What is outside those journals, if there's something?
Yes.
Excuse me, you have 6 minutes. Just because you gave me one, I'm giving you 6.
Yeah, a doctoral dissertation. Okay. Some of your questions focused on the definition of science, the autonomy of science, and what's the difference between pre-war educational science and after the Second World War. Now, that's why I insisted on I emphasized the scientific discipline model of two German scientists, and these are the characteristics of a science according to these authors. And we use this as a point of departure in order to define what we talk about science. Of course, the question raises, is science, if we have a normative approach, that we define what is science, and we don't find these characteristics in another historical period, what happens? Or do we think of science as something developing in a historical cultural context? Then we can say that in the communist period, educational science was like this. So this is another approach to science. I think this is one answer. Nevertheless, we think that the period we are talking about is a very sensitive one politically. So education is always linked to, in a way, to politics at any time. But this was a dictatorship. How it worked in a dictatorship. Then I thought that from the 1945 up to the 1990s was not a homogeneous period. Not in a political sense, not in an academic, scientific sense. Historians can talk about it in detail. In the 1950s, what was characteristic of educational science? Which characteristics, part of them, appeared later? Just one example. If we read educational texts from the 1950s and see the references, what bibliography these articles, these monographs have, what do we find? Stalin, Lenin, and Soviet authors. If we step further in the 60s, what do we find? Marx, Engels, some progressive Hungarian predecessors in educational science. And if we step further in the 1970s, then we can find the Western authors, English and American authors as well. We can witness the introduction of the programmed education, programmed learning, for instance, micro-teaching. They all come from the United States, and they are introduced in Hungarian educational science. That was impossible in the 1950s. So another question was about the child study approach, or two related questions. Reform pedagogy and child study approach has never been an academic subject in education in Hungary. It belonged to the elementary school teacher profession. So before the war, they didn't have academic positions at Hungarian universities, but they somehow reflected a sort of democratic view of science, of dealing with educational issues in a country which lacked democracy before the war as well. So that's why it seemed to be important to deal with child psychology, for instance, and issues like that. But it was opposed by the communist ideology because it concentrated on the individual child, and individualism was not accepted in communist ideology. A pedagogy was needed that is community-centered. So that was one reason why the representatives of child study movements were dismissed. Your question was about the journals. In this research, we used two journals. One was a very traditional journal called Magyar Pedagógia, Hungarian Education, established in 1892. And this went throughout the period except for 15 years from 1946 up till 1964, I think. But it is a traditionally now still existing periodical. The other one was established in 1949 for the purpose of disseminating communist ideology and communist education. These were the two journals we used and made a database of the articles and each pieces of text in the journals. Yes. Professor Karadi mentioned the new institutions established in the late 1940s, early 1950s. These were satellite institutions to there was a five-year plan in educational science as well. So these institutions were responsible to make these five-year plans in education, what to research, how to research, who are the persons in history of education who should be dealt with in detail, and this was educational research institute, and another one was an educational further education, pedagogical further education institute that was supposed to educate teachers and re-educate in a way them. These institutions ceased to exist in the early 1960s, and other research institutions were established. I think
Since we're very punctual, Victor gave me a bonus track. Would you like to say? We got 2 minutes maybe? No? Since they're free.
About the authors in the articles, we have as I have shown you, we have the data on the authors as well, which can be used in not only in statistical analysis but in qualitative analysis as well, and they show how these positions and academic ranks were introduced and established during the period. It's very, there is a line of research which examines investigates the authors, the different generation of authors, those who were educated in the pre-war period and what happened to them after these political changes. Were they dismissed from academic science, or could they adjust to it? Are there patterns that can be set up to see how these people behave in a very fierce political situation?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
From the University, Department of Regional Science, Budapest, and the title is The Communist Turning Hungarian Geography.
Yeah, so thank you very much. As it was mentioned, I'm from the Department of Regional Science, although I'm a geographer. This is belonging to a very turbulent story of Hungarian geography over the second part of the 20th century and the early 21st century. And actually, well, our purpose was, together with my colleague Zoli Gimesi, to explain quite briefly what happened to Hungarian geography after 1945. And I will speak about the first part, about the communist turn in the early period, and then Zoli will speak about quite many processes also concerning how we as geographers are working at a department called regional science. So, basically, I think it is indispensable for first to speak quite briefly about the role of geography in Hungarian academic and political and social context in the interwar period. Otherwise, it is almost impossible to understand those processes taking place here later on. Well, to put simply, interwar geography was belonging to the most acknowledged sciences. It belonged to the so-called homeland studies, which were expected to become the main producers of scientific legitimacy for the revisionist policies then political elites had, and for this reason geography gained enormous support from the state. Even a symbolic issue can be mentioned here. Pál Teleki, who you can see here, was not only one of the key geographers or the key geographer of the interwar period in human geography, but he also was prime minister twice, and so on and so on. So basically it is quite easy to see, I think, how strongly geography was interlinked with political issues, and actually quite most human geographers were involved in this national conservative project. It is very important to see, however, that this was a period in Hungarian human geography when it was quite a mainstream one, if we compare it to international streams. And it is also important to see that this interwar Hungarian geography had a very negative and very critical attitude towards those geopolitics in Nazi Germany, for example, which, well, posed a major threat to revisionary aims of the Hungarian elite. So what happened later on? After this glorious past, everything was entirely reinterpreted after 1945, especially since the new narrative was that the entire interwar regime was considered as fascist, and Pál Teleki, although he committed suicide in 1941 in order to protest against Hungary becoming involved in the Second World War on the side of the Axis, he was now interpreted as a fascist war criminal. And quite very obviously, also interwar bourgeois geography was considered guilty science for its quite strong position in the interwar period and due to its contribution to revisionary aims. The question is how it was possible to reshape Hungarian geography according to communist expectations. And well, to give some structure to my presentation, I just very briefly referred to Nádor's concept of the blood flow of science, which says that in order to establish a discipline and in order to sustain it, it is necessary to have a certain vernacular system, if you want, with instruments enabling you to mobilize the world, with colleagues who enable a sort of autonomization of the discipline. You need alliances, of course, both within and outside the academia, and you need public representation. So if you do not exist for, well, people out there, then you do not exist at all if you want. And it is also important that these vernacular systems should be attached to each other through links and knots, otherwise the system cannot function properly. And basically, interwar Hungarian geography had this quite strong vernacular system, so basically the task for the new regime was twofold. The first one was to block that old vernacular system, enabled the maintenance of interwar geography. This doesn't mean that everything was absolutely banned and stopped, but rather means that some parts were deleted and the configuration was reorganized. And of course, a new circulatory system should be established, which enabled later on the maintenance of, of a new geography in accordance with communist expectations. So, how was it possible to block this old blood flow of interwar geography for instruments? The main point was here to delegitimize the main underlying theoretical considerations of interwar geography. First of all, the unity of physical and human geography was severely attacked, since it was presented as environmental determinism, meaning, well, environmental determinism was an existing category in geography, especially in the colonial geographies of the UK, France, Germany, and so on, where the idea, or where the basic concept was that laws of natural sciences were used with relation to social issues in order to explain why those uncivilized people in Africa, for example, and in the tropics cannot have themselves, but we shall go there and civilize them. It is very important to see, however, that, for instance, the approach cultivated by Teleki was not this approach, but it was very strongly against this approach, because Teleki and his disciples thought that in this very materialistic interpretation, no place is left for human with spirit, as they used the term. Anyhow, geography as such, every source of geography before was criticized this way. The lack of practical utilization was also attacked, saying that all geography was simply too abstract and too philosophical, and that it focused on forms instead of identifying causal links behind the processes. And the whole national conservative project of nation building was also interpreted as something serving specific interests of imperialists and capitalists, and as a consequence leading sub-disciplines of this nation builder geography were banned, such as political and ethnic geography. Then for the institutional issue, or for autonomization, quite many institutions were simply disestablished, such as the Institute of Political Sciences. That was an institute founded by Teleki in the 1920s. Then there was a university department in Pécs, which was not reopened after the Second World War, and also the Hungarian Geographical Society was banned in 1949 for a few years. And with this also Földrajzi Közlemények Geographical Review, which was the main written publication forum of Hungarian academic geography, was stopped for a few years. And for personal issues, just a very brief example, before there were 4 geographers being members of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. All of them were expelled now. And only one of them could return later on as a physical geographer, so not as a human geographer. This will be important. For the alliances of this old interwar geography, well, with other disciplines, most alliances were not possible anymore, since quite many other disciplines were also banned, such as political science, or other ones were essentially transformed on the communist principles, such as in the case of anthropology. And of course, those strong ties towards the political power were also cut, since the interwar political elite was beheaded, and even non-communist political parties were banned basically after the communist term. And this shows quite well how even the international alliances of geography were reduced or were limited. Here we see some statistics about the relaunched geographical review, because it was relaunched in a new way, or in a new form after 1952, and you see that in the first 7-8 years, 94% of all the papers were written by Hungarian authors, almost 6% by Soviet authors, and 15 pages by authors from other countries. So this shows quite a strong reorientation. No German, no French, no British, and so on connections remained in this sense in the first period. And for public representation, again, just 2 examples. A popular science magazine of the Geographical Society was a Földgömb, the globe in the interwar period. This was simply not relaunched after the Second World War. And for public representation, well, I think it is speaking, Hungarian newsreel. In the early 1940s, Hungarian newsreel was beginning with maps of Greater Hungary and the so-called truncated Hungary, which was also, well, a platform of public representation for geography and cartography. And, well, this is the first newsreel from 1949, no map anymore, of course, and no ideas of revision. The question is, however, okay, so we stop this. But the question is, how then those radical changes can be implemented in Hungarian geography, which were expected by the new regime. Basically, while following this Latourian concept, I use here always the term blood transfusion. So this means what is commonly referred to as Sovietization, meaning again that some parts of some elements from the old vernacular system were sucked out, some new parts were added, quite many parts remained, but the entire way of organizing these vernacular systems changed. To give some examples, first, new goals were set for Hungarian geography, absolutely copying the Soviet model. The main goal was now to contribute to the construction of communism. what did it mean? Actually, practical orientation. Now geography had to contribute to economic planning and the transformation of nature. That was a huge step in this project in order to promote agricultural growth. Geography had to focus on economic production, and as a very important step, physical and economic geographies were separated from each other, and they were quite isolated later on in the first period. And of course, to show the new way, or the new path to follow, Soviet key texts were translated into Hungarian, not only ideological works, which were quite often referred by Hungarian geographers later on, but for instance, you see here, the first great book of Soviet economic geography, the economic geography of the USSR, which was published initially in the 1920s, but in 1950 the Hungarian version emerged, and of course it was highly praised by the geographers. Although Soviet geography was almost invisible for Hungarian geography. Then new people were found who had some quite typical common features. They were absolutely loyal to the Soviet as well as Hungarian Stalinist leaderships. They had a good understanding of Lenin's and Stalin's teaching. It is not a joke, actually, in this case. And they were personally involved in the communist movement. Anyhow, quite often they didn't have any formal education in geography, and quite often they didn't have a degree either. So basically the two most important guys in this vanguard of Marxist-Leninist geography was, in the early period, György Markos on the one hand, who actively participated in the Hungarian Soviet Republic in 1919. Later on he was an emigre, then he returned, but in the Second World War he was imprisoned. He was a journalist and a caricaturist, so not no geographer, but after the communist turn, he became the head of Palateleki's former university department until 1956, and also became vice president of the newly established or re-established Hungarian Geographical Society in 1952. Another guy was Nádor, Alexander Nádor, maybe you know his name since he was not only involved in the Soviet Republic, and he not only had a long Soviet experience and was fluent in Russian, but he was a Soviet spy in Second World War. Although he was, basically it is a long story, he was much more praised than what could be justified upon his actual contribution to the story, but this is maybe no geography anymore. Anyhow, he didn't have any university degree. But it's true that he was involved in cartography, so he had quite a fame for political cartography, political maps in the 1930s. And after the Second World War, he spent a few years in a Soviet theme park, if you want. So, in the first labor camp, he had to spend almost 10 years, and after that, he returned to Hungary, where he then became the second head of Teleki's former university department after Markos. Later on, he became the president of the Geographical Society and even became a member of the International Geographical Union because he had an international fame. And even in the second line of geographers, many new experts like this emerged. Of course, the question comes whether all geographers had any place in this new discipline. Some had since they joined the Communist Party. Some others had because they absolutely give up all topics related to human geography and solely concentrated later on physical geography, which was considered as less painful for the regime. But for some there was no mercy. So especially for some young disciples of some established geographers of the interwar period, they were simply put to the periphery and basically driven out from the academy. And an institutional shift took place as well because, as I think you all know, this is a quite typical story in the former communist bloc, that a Soviet-type Academy of Sciences was established as the Stalinist super organ of scientific life, and universities became subordinated. At the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, a new geographical research group was established. It had not existed before in this form, and this became the new center of calculation. And also a new journal was launched by this research group, Földrajzi Értesítő, Geographical Bulletin. It is true, however, that the Geographical Society was also relaunched in 1952 after being Sovietized, and its journal was also relaunched, but basically I would say as a second-rank journal. So the first one was this new one. And to see, again, at the level of symbolism, the difference you see the front cover of one issue of Geographical Review, not from 1944, still with the old stamp, the old coat of arms, and so on. And of course, subtitles in French, in English, and in German and in Italian. And now, for the new journal, the new front cover, absolutely modernistic, absolutely communistic, and quite different. Okay, thank you. And this new geography needed new alliances which were established in profoundly new directions. So, of course, it was still important to have good ties to the political regime, which meant in these years the Hungarian Working People's Party. Then strong links were established to economic production, because that was one point of criticism towards interwar geography, as I mentioned, that they were too abstract and, well, basically they did not serve the material needs of economic production. Now it was important to have a good relation to agriculture and industry. Nowadays we would say the market, but of course in that context it would be an absolutely irrelevant term. And for the disciplinary level, regional and urban economic planning was set as a main goal for this new geography, so the new disciplinary links pointed mainly towards economics and engineering, which was also quite uncommon, although I cannot say that no predecessors of this existed before the communist term. Still, I have to say that this shift was quite radical. Okay. And finally, public representation was also important for two reasons. First, this new geography had to show itself for the public, but on the other hand, it was used as a platform of advertising the real or claimed achievements of the new communist system. Just two examples how geography as popular science could be mobilized as means of propaganda. One book, of course, from Soviet authors, I mean the initial version, The Soviet People Transforms Nature. Well, we understand the issue. And this was published in 1951 as a Soviet népát alakítja a természetet, that is basically the same, and it was spread all over the country for public libraries. And this is just one of the many examples, of course. And the geography was also involved not only in economic planning, but in propagating economic planning and advertising economic planning. You see here the front cover of a 1948 book, The Economy of Hungary and the Three-Year Plan. That was basically rather an atlas, collection of maps, because in the introduction it was explained that the map is the best tool to inform people about what is in the background. So, well, basically maps had been useful before the communist term, and of course they remained useful after the communist term. They were quite sufficient in surviving. So as a conclusion, I would say that after the communist term, the circulatory system of this whole geography was blocked, and it was successfully blocked from the point of view of the new system. Anyhow, I have to underscore again that it doesn't mean that everything was deleted and now new geography was built from scratch. So that's not true. Quite many things were destroyed. Quite many things were pushed to the periphery. Quite many elements were reorganized. So, of course, the consequences were quite severe, but still, there was a strong discontinuity, but even continuities could be found in several questions. And this new blood flow was established, which was only possible in my interpretation through this violent blood transfusion, as I use the term, which again was successful from the point of view of the regime, but it had its cost because many subdisciplines were banned, many individual careers were wrecked, and basically, that is maybe not that self-evident. Thank you. The last one. Geography was forced into cooperation with new allies who were much stronger than it was. So in the interwar period, geography had, especially speaking about the social sciences which were into human geography, geography's position was not weaker than the position of these other disciplines. But after the communist term, basically all allies were stronger, much stronger. And this has indeed an implication on the future of geography, even nowadays, basically, because this meant that geography was pushed to a much lower level in the hierarchy of academic life. And we still suffer from this, and we are present at conferences like this in order to do something to cure this problem. So that was basically the last slide, and as I mentioned, Zoli will continue it with the other story, but so I finish it now, and maybe if there are questions, so I'm open to answer anything.
And visualization of space, which is a way of referring to geography, I was wondering, I was waiting to see actually how what you are describing on an institutional level and on a biographical level of the scholars actually travels into the artifacts produced by geographers, and thus influences the way space is viewed and conceptualized. Because I think you work with visuals a lot in your presentation, but I think this would make it an even stronger case, both of the continuities and of discontinuities. Because again, a map probably is a limiting instrument, so showing what actually changes about how human geography is mapped, I think that would be very interesting to see.
Any other question? Victor?
Well, I have a number of smaller remarks, rather questions. One, you mentioned that Teleki was tagged as a fascist. Well, there were nevertheless reasons for this, because he was committed to the production of two anti-Jewish laws, which is, well, a kind of qualification for fascism. Well, not all kinds of fascism, but Nazi type of fascism, even if he was an anti-Nazi, as we know. So, first remark. Second remark, geography, however it was transformed, survived the communist turnover, which other social sciences did not survive. Sociology did not survive, political science did not survive. So it was nevertheless something of a positive development in this sense, at least, of survival. Okay. Third, which is really a question, from the early 50s, with the reorganization of the university system and the whole university reform, and the reform of the Academy of Sciences, in which geography was heavily concerned, you have the appearance of the first candidates of the and doctors of the Academy of Sciences. Now there, what was the first? It was a chance of promotion for new geographers. I know it was a very weak thing, because not many could do that, but still it was a new line of promotion, which later became, to my knowledge, quite significant. But my question has to do with the relationship, with the discipline of geography as compared to the earth sciences, because the two notions appeared at that time, to my knowledge. Earth sciences on one hand and geography on the other hand. What were the relations in concrete terms within this institutional framework you are describing?
I just wanted to ask you about, I mean, you made this list of how actually the communists were deconstructing basically pre-war geographical science, but it seemed to me that the list could be, or is very similar to how like Mark Wessing or even Neumann or people, historians of, modern historians of geography would actually describe paradigmatic historiography, geography, which they consider to be nationalist, non-constructivist, essentialist, ethnocentric, whatever. So it seems to me that there is a certain kind of resonance between this kind of criticism and communist criticism, and it's not because these guys are communists or postmoderns are communists, but there was an epistemic problem with this kind of anthropogeographic tradition that was dominant in the interwar period, even though, of course, you could claim that there were sort of some elements which were not connected to anthropogeography. This first, and then if it's so, then isn't it that the decay of geography that you are describing is not a Hungarian phenomenon, not even an Eastern Bloc phenomenon, but a global phenomenon? That basically geography epistemologically collapsed practically in the after 1945, as much in Western Germany as in Eastern Germany, and then it recovers practically from the perspective that you are actually representing, who historicizes geographical knowledge and who is not doing anymore actually a hardcore geographical reconstruction, but actually tries to look at spatializing strategies as a kind of epistemological reloading.
No other questions? I have one. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yes, taking into account the description that you made of these not new necessarily, but the geographers that you've described, and the conditions in which they are working, and the effectiveness of this that you call the transfusion. My question is, do we really have to use this concept of the transfusion? Is it the correct one? And what is, in the long term, the effectiveness of this transfusion? You said until nowadays, I'm from Argentina, I really don't know what you're talking about, so I would like to know. And if it's related to the name of this department, the regional studies, the geography department, what is the difference here between these two things? There's another question? I saw a hand? No. I think you have enough. And
Yes.
you have 6 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So I try to be short. So the first question: how these changes became manifest in the artifacts produced by geography? Well, it is of course a large story, but I think it says volumes if I briefly refer to which three issues were the main new goals set for geography, I mean specific issues. One was how new economic plans could be introduced to Hungary. The second one was how perfect and optimal spatial division can be created for spatial economic planning. And this relates to the artifacts because what they were trying was basically to, well, have the map of the country, and they try to identify objectively existing economic regions which are there, but we still have to identify them. Of course, that was a never-ending story, so basically each concept was different, and after a while it simply, well, died away for a while. And there were many questions, even from the side of many leading communist geographers in other countries, such as in GDR or in Bulgaria, whether it made sense to copy the Soviet sort of economic planning in a country being smaller than one region in the Soviet Union. In Hungary, this question was much less tolerated in an interesting way, at least in the early years than in the GDR, for example. And the third issue was how geography can contribute to rationalizing the urban network in Hungary, meaning how geography can contribute to making the urban network more efficient in the sense that all those small settlements that were considered uneconomical in the long run could be demolished in a planned way. So these were the three main goals, and all those artifacts produced in these research processes were outcomes of this new geography. Well, for Teleki and about his interpretation, of course, I think it is not my task here to make a general historical evaluation, but one thing is certain, that in this case, as it was quite typical, for example, the person of Teleki was, considered as equal with almost the entire geography, which is on the one hand problematic, and in the other hand it is remarkable that in 1945, the reputation of Teleki, or the interpretation of Teleki's political role was controversial, of course, but it was more positive than negative in 1945. But Erzsébet Antics, who was the main historiographer of the Soviet period, was quite firm, even in her first work about this issue. So the point is rather that there was no debate about these questions. What is good, what is bad? Of course, the question is quite complicated. Well, you can say that geography was quite a positive story because it survived. So there is an old joke about Lenin who don't kill all those guys playing football in front of the Kremlin, although he could do that. So, I don't know whether we should be happy with that or not. Then, a very interesting question: the chances for new geographers in the doctoral candidate system. It is really interesting because that was again a place to filter out some old geographers. It was typical that many of them, who had been members of the academy even before, he were not simply expelled, but later on it was blocked anyway. That they received something like this. So Tibor Mendel was a leading urban geographer. He had been member of the Academy of Sciences. He was expelled, and he died in 1965 without any official recognition in this form. He was only recognized in 66, 1 year after his death, in this way. Okay, yes, earth sciences and geography. Well, I would say that in the interwar period and before, this discipline was not that well structured. So these categories were absolutely intertwined. Later on, a sort of separation began. And it is really interesting that geology or geophysics, which were considered by the new system as essential for economic growth. We need coal, we need iron ore, we need everything, and so on. So these were pushed very strongly by the new system, while geography, and especially the human part of geography, was handled in an absolutely other way. So it is really interesting how this improved later on. Okay, so Marxist, Leninist, Communist, postmodern, and so on, points of criticism. This is a broad story. I would maybe say something that, well, Marxist geographies in the West and Marxist social sciences in the so-called Western world and postmodern criticism was against an established regime. And in Hungary, we are speaking about something which had the goal to absolutely justify an existing authoritarian regime, a dictatorship. That might be one important difference, although there are similarities. So it is absolutely true that the story is broad. Okay, well, geography, yes, well, geography collapsed in 1945 as a global phenomenon. In some countries, yes, in some countries, not really. So in the Soviet Union, for example, it had a boom after the Second World War, just to give an exception. But really, so, well, again, this would be a new topic. Well, whether the term transfusion, blood transfusion should be used, well, it's open to debate. So as I mentioned, it is just my concept, and you can say that I'm foolish. That's no problem. So really, I'm happy to have any better, well, suggestions. And finally, what is regional science then? That's a very good question, but I think this is belonging to the paper of Zoli, so I don't want to, well, take his job. I think he will speak about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Short in 6 minutes, thank you. Now we're going to call Zoltán Imes. How do you pronounce the last name? Imes. From the Department of Social and Economic Geography, Budapest, and the title is Towards a Globalized Understanding of Cold War Geography in Hungary. This one is new.
Okay. Thank you very much for. I'm very glad to be here. It's an honor to present here at CEU. What I'm going to talk about is not really Hungary, case Hungary. So you might be, it might not be what you expect. It has two reasons. One is this globalized perspective that I want to talk about, to position Hungary in a kind of a more global narrative. And the other thing is that I've actually done this research when I was a master's student, and I have been dealing with other things since I'm a PhD student. So I'm just developing my empirical analysis on Hungary, in the case of Hungary. So I'm just, I will have some preliminary archival research for Hungary. But I already started. Now, what does this globalized understanding mean? Now, I would like to refer to Karpolany Research Center and what we're doing at Working Group for Public Sociology, Helyzet. We're trying to understand Hungary's position in the global hierarchy as a semi-peripheral state or a semi-peripheral region. And we're going to do that, and doing that also to Eastern Europe. So what we're going to talk about the global circulations, movements, knowledge, and knowledge production embedded in this more global structural context. Okay, and what I'm focusing on is generally geography and spatial planning, okay, in this Cold War context. Now, what initially comes in is the so-called quantum revolution, which was only used in geography, as far as I know. So it was a source of a struggle between the new generation and the old one to state that what they're doing is a kind of a quantitative, what is a kind of scientific revolution. So they use Kuhn to, legitimate that. I've done some research on that, and it originated from America. So what I started to do in this research is to see what I was educated in, for example, regional science and all these quantitative and statistical methods in spatial planning, and to trace the genealogy of this kind of knowledge, where it originated from, and I found that it became mainstreamized through American in the 1950s and 60s. And there was an interesting Western distribution of these ideas. So what I'm focusing on is knowledge of mathematical and spatial planning, so this mathematized kind of doing knowledge production. This means a whole host of things. What I'm really interested in is the role of technocratism and scientism in the way that we try to argue through mathematical models that it is actually a rational way to distribute like resources and to plan the economy or to plan cities and urban networks. And I was looking at the political and ideological intentions behind that. First, I focused on America, so I'm going to talk more about America, but then I focused on other regions also. Now, I've been going through a shift from discourse to narratives, so how this quantum revolution was used as a label, and all these types of knowledge was used in different contexts. And now I'm focusing on how to conceptualize agency and the structure explanation. Now, quantum revolution is still used as a kind of rhetoric when we're talking about big data and all sorts of new quantum analysis. I even been to a conference a few months ago in Hungary, and they tried to use this kind of label. So it's a kind of how we remember the past. It's a question that turns back to. Now, what I'm using as a concept is this Cold War science. Why is that important? I think that it's important because this goes beyond these capitalist and socialist categories, which are, a child of the Cold War rhetoric. But of course, we can see these American-Soviet hegemonic power relations and scientific interchange, which I'm talking about. And I'm mainly following Joanna Bockman on the international and global knowledge and actor networks, understanding these actor networks which are working behind these processes. And there's also a historical lineage when I look at the Hungarian context, this whole Sovietization which Ferenc talked about, through socialist and post-socialist geography. So there are continuities and ruptures that are going on, and how these were affected by these globalized structures. My approach is, I'm actually trying to I won't go into details, but I'm trying to interweave three kinds of theories. I think post-colonial theory is better in the context of Sovietization, but it more tends to become provincial when we only focus on the colonizer and the colonized, and we might not, look situated in a more globalized perspective in working on networks. So that's why I use actor network theory to trace all these actants. So there might be technologies and theories, not only people or maybe institutions that are traveling. Now, the problem with actor network theories is the problem with power, and it's totally scaleless. So you cannot really conceptualize these normative things and ideological things like subject formation when we're talking about technocratism. And all these global cycles of accumulation. There's some literature I'm using, the historical geographies of scientific knowledge, so it's a really broad thing. There's been a lot of work done by Heidelberg University. And of course, just to point out one thing, that this kind of approach has been mainly be used to describe the center, like a colonial imperial geography, like the British case, and not used, for example, in Eastern Europe. So I'm trying to do some pioneering work on using this kind of approach here. Now, there's interesting literature also on the role of war in changing the nature of geography and geographical knowledge. I have to point out the positive role of war in creating new kind of disciplines and approaches and consolidating these kind of new approaches. And the fact that geography was formed in the end of the, as an institutionalized university subject and in teaching in the end of the 19th century was closely connected for the Franco-Prussian War. And also closely connected for the Scramble of Africa, for example, in which in 2 decades they just partitioned Africa, and maybe it was done by geographers. So it's closely connected to not only the imperial and colonial context, but to war. And in this case, it was World War II. So I looked on how World War II transformed geography. And in the US case, we could see that it was like the Office of Strategic Services, which was like a calculation center. Okay, center of calculation where all kinds of scholars came in. There was no teaching for a period at universities, only training of officers. And there was an interesting place where an interpolation of these people into not only serving the nation, but also in enabling this kind of interchange or interdisciplinary interchange between different disciplines which were more isolated in this kind of academic kind of knowledge production. Some people talk about the post-academic kind of knowledge production from their own, or mode 2 kind of knowledge production of science. Now the main things that happened here, which might, they're arguable. I don't really like this kind of more static kind of talking about it. It totally changed the way of science that was produced. We could find analogies in the past of the fact that of this interdisciplinary or working on joint projects of heterogeneous teams, but it did become the work of the day. So this kind of military language and hierarchy reshaped scientific language, but also scientific technology reshaped the military, and the emergence of research universities and huge amounts of funding into science and higher education was prevalent at in this era, and forming of basic research. So these are like new kind of developments. And these kind of disciplines or these kind of new kind of approaches emerged like systems theory, cybernetics, and social physics, which also affected geography. Now there's also a lot of literature on this if you are interested. Now in the case of America, just to cut it short, there was this old regional geography. In this case, especially in geography, I would say, US was in the periphery. They were constantly trying to copy the center, which was mainly Germany. Like in the case of Richard Hawthorne, who was very influential and was the main target for these new geographers. He literally copied Arthur Tetler's book. So he kind of produced an American version. The same happened for in the case of other scholars. And Churchill Sample, for example, copied Theodore Trachtel's book, Anthropogeography, and it's interesting the way that they try to do this copying and leaving out this organic idea of the state, for example. So this is what happens, that it actually, this new kind of geography focuses more on space, not a bounded entity like the region, which is more historical. It kind of tried to follow a more theoretical and deductive approach. It was more liberal, more focusing on the urban. It was connected in this kind of big science, which was more connected, scientific knowledge production was more connected to the industry. This is kind of new working environment using computers and new kind of maps that they produced, and actually the same kind of maps kind of emerged in Hungary also when they tried to adapt it. But the problem was that they, as I will show, is that the main theories that they mainstreamized in this era were coming from Germany. So I focused on these kind of location theories and one more about Walter Klister's theory, which is actually what August Lösch tried to work on a bit more. Well, the problem is narrativity, that this kind of new knowledge, this mathematized, more econocentric approach, totally concealed the actual context of production of these theories. For example, Alfred Weber followed more a historical approach to economy, and this kind of the locational triangle, which is about where to locate an industrial plant, and you can talk about the workforce, labor force, and raw materials. And you can later on they kind of mathematize this to calculate with computers, was actually embedded in a critique towards industrializing society. And in Continuum, it was his density of agricultural rings, and inside you can see the market town. So later on they use it in an urban setting also to look at the different functions that are spatially layered in the city. There's a central business district, for example, you can see residential areas and industry. So they use it in different contexts, but it was embedded in the idea of the ideal state that he was writing on, and how to provide even wages for people, for example. So interesting idea. And the case of Lösch is most connected to what Christopher, which was about planning the settlement system and settlement hierarchies. So there are different hierarchies, settlements in terms of the market and services, the basic idea was that it is mathematical, so you could quantify and model the spatiality of settlements. Now, what's interesting, just to give you one little snapshot, I know it's a bit radical, but this whole idea, the places, the different places that these theories were used, Americans used it in the Third War to, for example, develop Kenya or kind of an African state. But it was also used later on in the 60s and 70s, as I'll argue. But what I'm questioning is that what's the mutability of these theories? For example, Walter-Christoller's theory was used after 1939 to redevelop or reconstruct invaded Poland by the Nazis. And this whole kind of context of applying this theory was totally unknown for Americans who mainstreamized this theory. So all these assumptions that may lie behind the theory, as in constructing a kind of German landscape for Germans against the Slavic nations, or the fact that these kind of more organic theories are adapted to the idea of the nation state, were like left out of their narratives. And this kind of research on what happened was done only from the 2000s. Talk about the consequences of divergence connected to World War II. There are a lot of examples. I'm mainly focusing on the German monopoly of spatial economics to going to the USA, as Mark Blog, economic historian, also points out. There are also other things connected to these, and you can see the consequences of, for example, the Nobel Prize winners going up as a consequence of many women scholars emigrating to the US previously. So I looked at these 1930s era of Austrian and German economists fleeing to the US, and thank you. And the whole Vienna Circle went to the US, which largely influenced the kind of philosophy that was done. This pragmatic philosophy, and later on it became philosophy of science, and the unity of science movement was interestingly influencing American thinking, which also influenced disciplines like geography. Arguing for only one mathematical and modeling kind of positivist kind of method in science. Now, if we look at other contexts, we could ask was it a form of diffusion, and what diffuse actually? If we're talking about diffusion, that will mean that something goes out and it somehow stays the same. If we talk about active networks, we'll look at all the sorts of translations that happen and going on, which point to a different kind of adapting to certain geographical contexts. So every context was different, but the interesting thing I think in this research is that since these were mathematical concepts, they were really in a sense immutable and in a sense very mutable. So you could put in all sorts of parameters and you could reform the theory, but the basic idea stayed the same. So it could really travel fast, and it could be replicated in different contexts. Now, in the Canadian context, for example, the role of the state was very important for developing this new kind of science in geography. The same thing was might be said for the Swedish context. In America, the private private money was increasingly more important, and the role of the military. And later on, these theories, as I will show, came back, and people from the 60s started to talk about doing the quantum revolution as it came back to Germany. You can see. So I'm talking about what Ferry has explained. I just point out a few things about this. This translation also means a translation of interest, and translation also means change in ontology. So when Nádor talks about the mobilization of the world, that means actually translating the world into your new language, and translating the interests of each other could be interesting to see how these kind of new disciplines and new scientific languages emerge. And what Nádor is talking about is inherently spatial. So for strengthening of a new actor network, it must be spatially extended. Now, just to be more explicit in this, what really happened, as I just explained, is when US was a periphery, there was an emigration, and there was adaptation of German theories, and there was this interesting alliance at Lund for American geographers, and most of these northern universities were doing this new way of doing geographical science. And then it came back to the continent. The works of American geographers, there was a new kind of a new way of so there was a new so it kind of came back to the continent, which is very interesting because so this kind of Nazi period also meant a kind of gap in the case of Germany. And there was also an important connection with Bristol and Cambridge in the UK. So like in the 50s, scholars like Brian Berry could come to the US, and David Harvey could come to the US and study there, and they developed the same thing in the UK. And in the 30s and 50s, there was a negligation in the Stalin period. In the 60s, there was a Soviet adaptation in the way of mathematization in the Soviet Union, as I will explain. And actually, Hungarian geographers read it in Russian. So you could see these networks going on, and you could see that, actually what I think is that you could see also this interchange and this international mobility between scholars. Okay, so this was Perry was talking about what happened in the 50s. It's kind of more empirical and statistic kind of doing geography under this planning economy by Jön Markos, who was actually a kind of founder of a new kind of spatial planning tradition, but it did not include theory. It was more inclined to party ideology. In the center-periphery relation, you can see that there was initial damnation of formal mathematical models deemed as bourgeois formalism, and that led to also kind of this key to mathematical knowledge, as Leon Smolinski talks about the fact that economists couldn't even read Karl Marx, couldn't even understand his arithmetics. So it was a kind of a harsh statement. But in the case, for example, of Weber, you could see that there was also this reason that he did not legitimate the Soviet Eastern Industrial Zone, which was more legitimated by militaristic purposes. After Discontinuities, and I'll finish in another slide, you can see that what I was talking about, they translated the main American works after the 23rd Party Congress, and it was embedded in this debate of market economy and planning economy. Mathematics was used as a neutral field to legitimate this kind of interchange. The US thought that they could influence USSR politics to letting in their kind of theories. And in Hungary was the case now to situate it, what it ended up in. What was the end of the story is that under this new economic mechanism and its preparation reform, economists largely influenced geographers also, and in the new settlement plan and regulation they used Kristall's theories and ideas. There was a more shift to a more technocratic and de-ideologized language, and I think it was more of a global shift, so it could be embedded in this global shift. And the role, I was looking at the role of research institutes and National Planning Office in the diffusion of quantum spatial analysis and classical economics into geography. And why is it important? Because as Lampan, Marta Lampan, I'd like to argue that there was a technopolitical lineage, not only between the pre-1949 geography and after the communist term, but also after 1989, they largely used the same kind of theories when they were doing like EU regional policy. And Hungarian regional science was born in this period, although it was typically a Polish science that was born in America in the 1950s. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry.
We're taking questions now. I have 7 minutes, so I can wait for you to wait for questions.
I have a very short question. Actually, on one of your slides, there was a point which interests me. I could understand that you pointed to a relation between the Frankfurt School and the famous Rand Corporation. Could you please explain this relation?
Well, some people connected to that were global Americans, and they were trying to use critical. So they believe that we're actually fighting fascism. So there was a period of and later on, like I had with Marcuse, we could talk about Marcuse. After his involvement in the Rand Corporation, he wrote One-Dimensional Man, which was actually the critique of the same establishment where he was working in this American context. So it's very interesting that how this context changed.
Aren't you using this theoretical framework about core social science to make the case for the mathematization of geography